Hi everyone, this is another video on section 4.9, barriers to economic growth and or economic development. Last time we looked at economic barriers. This time we're going to look at more political/social barriers. So generally we can find in these countries that there is a weak institutional framework. So the institutions are the bodies that really govern the country, that allow economic growth and economic development to happen. So we're going to have a look at those. So the general legal framework, this is needed so that we can have justice for people and some sort of dispute resolution process. This is often underdeveloped in developing countries. And what we have seen is that poverty is often the result of disempowerment, exclusion, and discrimination. So the legal framework isn't protecting them. Next, we'll look at ineffective taxation structures. So in these developing countries, there is often a concentration of political power by the wealthy, and this means they get to influence what the government does. They get to influence the tax structures of the country. So they often push for low tax rates because the wealthy don't need the things that taxes tend to go to. They don't need the government to provide healthcare or education because they're wealthy enough to afford it themselves. So they just push for low taxes and therefore they don't have to contribute as much. There tends to be lower property tax rates as well because it's the wealthy who actually own property in these countries. So it's in their interest to have low property tax rates. Lots of tax exemptions get tacked onto legislation. These allow the rich to stay rich, to avoid paying their taxes to the government. And there is, of course, some corruption involved as well, which is the public officials using their power for their own gain. So they might get paid off, by these influential people or receive some sort of benefit from them. So all of this results in this familiar lack of money, lack of government revenue. We've seen how important government spending is to encouraging growth and development previously. So without that, it's going to cause a bit of problem. It's going to cause some inequities. Because there are low direct tax rates, so taxes on income, there's more of a reliance on indirect taxes. These are easier to collect because they're collected when people spend money. Generally considered by economists much easier to collect. But we've seen this much earlier in the course that indirect taxes tend to be regressive in nature. So they affect the lower income people much more than the higher income earners. Okay, we'll get some negative impacts on resource allocation. Tax advantages, well-connected firms will receive tax advantages because they've got that political power, and the larger firms can more easily avoid the taxes. What that actually becomes a bit of a barrier to entry. So let's think of, for the HL students, think of market structures, barriers to entry. If we have less competition in our markets, then we have worse allocative efficiency, right? Capital goods, this is another tax structure. Capital goods tend to have lower tariffs on them. So what that can lead to is incentivizing that firms within the country invest in capital intensive technology. Whereas what we've seen is that in these developing countries, more appropriate technology is to have the labor intensive because we need people in work. Okay, banking is hugely important for growth and development. So why is it important? It gives people an incentive to save. They get a return on their savings if they put it in the bank, right? Interest rates. They provide credit for firms to both open and then also to expand their business. You need startup capital. It's highly unlikely that many firms would ever start if they needed to provide all the cash up front and weren't able to access credit for that. And credit can also be crucial for households so that they can invest in their own human capital. So loans for education and to cover their health expenses, for the poor especially. But a problem in these developing countries is that they have low bank deposits, because a lot of these people, they don't have disposable income to put into their banks. And often the wealthy like to keep their assets overseas in other banks. And what can also be a problem with banking in developing countries is that banks just want to lend to multinationals and the wealthy, because they don't have a huge bank of savings to lend out, say this 15%. So they lend it out to the more lower risk people, so multinationals and the wealthy. That means the poor end up with little access to credit. So the poor, little access to opening and expanding businesses and investing in their own human capital. Property rights, laws and regulations that define rights to ownership. These are often unsecure or insecure in developing countries. So for that reason, less economic activity is going to happen. So it's risky to open a business, so opening a shop or a factory, if you don't have clear, protected ownership of that shop or factory. Entrepreneurs with property rights, they're much more likely to reinvest their profits and grow their business if their property rights are protected. And banks are more likely to lend to you to buy a property or to expand on a property if they can see that you clearly have the rights and that those rights will be protected. So property rights equals economic growth. Often the problem with these countries is their laws and processes around property rights aren't developed enough, and people can't take the risks involved in economic activity because the property rights just aren't secure. Okay, gender inequality is pretty big. So inequalities in education. This is just a few selected countries, but the story is pretty much the same across developing countries, that boys receive much more schooling than girls. That is changing, but this is still a problem, because what's really happening is that's really allocative inefficiency. You're really disempowering 50% of your potential workforce. You're not getting the full potential because half of the workforce just aren't getting a proper education. So that can be a huge barrier to development. Inequalities in the labour market. We get similar issues here. So the lower education leads to less opportunities in the labour market. Discrimination is part of the reason that girls get less education in the first place. Families, if they have to make the choice between educating their son or their daughter, they will generally choose their son. And women tend to work a lot in the informal sector, which means that their work conditions aren't as good. Inappropriate governance. So poor governance leads to poor outcomes. Makes sense. What makes good governance? Some researchers have come up with these six ideas that essentially make good governance. So all involved in the decision making. So access to casting votes, for example, democracy, fairness. Rules apply to everyone equally. No one gets special treatment. Decency. Rules don't harm or humiliate. Accountability. Leaders are held responsible to society, so democracy is a big part of that. But also just having to answer the questions posed by the public and the media. Transparency is the reasoning behind decisions is clear, and the decisions are clear and open for everybody. And efficiency, we want our scarce resources used without waste, delay, or corruption. We'll get back to corruption as well. So corruption, we talked about this a few times already, the abuse of public office for private gain. So think of bribery. If you're a government official and you take bribes to do things, what happens is this acts like a tax, and it's often regressive because to get something done you need to pay a tax. So it's sort of like an indirect tax, so it's going to be a larger proportion of income for low income earners, and it can distort the incentives in markets. And also it's worse than a tax, because a tax actually provides revenue to the government to spend on merit goods, like health and education, but bribery does not do that. It just goes into the pockets of corrupt officials. Not nearly as useful. Kickbacks we might get. So if you award a building contract to a company, if you're a government official, you award a building contract, they might give you back some money. It's not quite a bribe, but it's a kickback. Nepotism, people just hiring their family, making sure their family and friends get contracts and whatnot. And straight up just essentially stealing, embezzlement, stealing public funds. So this leads to allocative inefficiency. Resources aren't allocated to their best use. If the best companies aren't doing the work, then that's inefficient. If bribes have to be taken, that's inefficient. So we get reduced growth and therefore reduced development as well. Okay, and unequal political power and status. So some groups tend to have more political power than others in some countries. Could be landowners, bankers, etc. So we sort of talked about this, but they're going to influence policies in their own self-interest, and therefore that usually is in opposition to the interests of the lower income earners, those without power. Another example of this is the caste system, where social position is actually determined by birth. It might be your religion, so it might be a dominant religion, and you just don't have access to political power if you're not part of that. Could be skin color, could be racial. And of course, often discrimination, prejudice, conflict, especially in a lot of these developing countries. Their country borders weren't actually made by them, so there can be inherent conflict within the country along racial or ethnic lines. And political instability, this is slightly related, but political instability is bad because political instability causes uncertainty. People don't know who's going to be in charge, what they stand for. And we've sort of seen this idea throughout the course that certainty, since we've done macro, certainty leads to firms investing, and that can lead to economic growth. So uncertainty won't lead to the investment, which won't lead to the economic growth, and that's the problem.